What fueled the men who rode through dust storms, faced down outlaws, and pushed cattle across hundreds of unforgiving miles? The answer isn't glamorous, but it's far more interesting than Hollywood ever showed you. A cowboy's diet in the Old West was rugged, resourceful, and sometimes downright shocking. From beans simmered over open flames to biscuits hard enough to break a tooth, their meals were born out of survival, grit, and whatever they could pack on the trail. Today, we're stepping back into the frontier to uncover what a real cowboy actually ate: the good, the bad, and the meals that kept them in the saddle from sunup to sundown. If you enjoy these deep dives into Old West life, leave a comment sharing your favorite cowboy food fact, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more frontier history just like this. Cowboy eating habits in daily life were heavily influenced by the people who had worked the land long before American settlers pushed west. Living in an era before refrigeration, cowboys depended on foods that could last for months or even years without spoiling. Because of this, they adopted many Native American methods of preserving food, such as drying and smoking. While riding the trail, it was common for cowboys to forage for whatever nature offered. Wild herbs, berries, and even bird eggs could end up in their pots. Still, most of their diet came from basic staples they carried with them. These supplies might not have been fancy, but they provided solid, filling meals that could sustain a working crew through long, dusty days of hard labor. Cowboys were also strongly influenced by Mexican vaqueros. These experienced cattle herders had been managing livestock in the region long before American settlers arrived. Vaqueros created many of the tools and techniques of the trade, such as chaps and lassos. And in the early years of the West, they trained many future cowboys. Because they had been driving cattle for centuries, vaqueros were highly skilled at living and cooking on the move. Cowboys borrowed not just their gear and riding style, but also many of their recipes and ways of preparing simple, nourishing food on the trail. When it comes to what cowboys actually ate, historian Dr. Richard W. Slatta of North Carolina State University quotes Oklahoma cowboy Puny Martin's short and direct description of Old West food: beef, beans, taters. That's what you had to have. Some cowboys enjoyed a bit more variety during cattle drives, but overall, their choices were still quite limited compared to what we're used to today. Cows made the cowboy. The cowboy's role emerged alongside the growth of ranching in the Americas, an industry deeply connected to colonial history. Spanish settlers were the first to bring cattle across the Atlantic, transporting them on early voyages to the New World. Herding quickly became successful in the Southwest, particularly in regions of Mexico and Texas, where skilled vaqueros set the standard for cattle management. Texas eventually developed into the center of the cattle business. Before the Civil War, however, cattle were valued less for their meat and more for the resources they provided. Hides were turned into leather, a durable and highly practical material. Even more valuable was the fat, which could be rendered into tallow. This versatile substance was essential in daily life, used for cooking, soap making, and producing candles, an important necessity in a time before electric lighting. As the Civil War approached, the expansion of the railroad system opened new opportunities. Rail lines made it far easier to transport goods across long distances, allowing ranchers to meet the rising demand for beef in rapidly growing cities. The vast grasslands and open plains of the American West offered ideal conditions for raising large herds, further fueling the industry. This combination of technological change, consumer need, and abundant land created the environment in which the cowboy became an essential part of the American economy. By the mid-19th century, the cowboy had become a key figure in supporting westward growth and sustaining the expanding ranching frontier. Chuck wagon fare changed the cowboy diet. In the earliest days of the American West, cowboys had very limited food options. They ate whatever they could pack into their saddlebags or obtain directly along the way, often relying on simple portable ingredients. As the demand for beef increased, with waves of people moving west in search of gold, land, and opportunity, the small crews that once handled cattle evolved into larger, organized operations. Ranching became a major industry, and cattle had to be moved in great numbers to meet the growing market. The cowboy's main responsibility, as the name implies, was to manage and move cattle. This meant driving large herds from remote ranches across long distances to markets, auction points, or railroad depots, where the animals could be sold and shipped. Traveling through wide stretches of open country, cowboys had no formal lodging or dining facilities, just the open sky for both sleeping and eating. Although the work lacked the romantic shine later added by movies and dime novels, one important innovation brought a bit of comfort: the chuck wagon. Credited to rancher Charles Goodnight, this rolling kitchen was adapted from an army supply wagon and traveled with the crew on cattle drives. The chuck wagon was fitted with cast iron kettles, pans, and Dutch ovens, and was usually pulled by a team of up to 6 oxen. It carried flour, coffee, beans, cured meat, and other staples. While it was far from lightweight, it allowed the cook to prepare hot, freshly made meals instead of relying only on dry or preserved rations. In cowboy slang, chuck became the word for food. This style of home-cooked trail fare was a significant improvement over what cowboys had previously lived on. Sharing meals together outdoors in the afternoons and evenings helped build a sense of community, and nourishing food made long days on the trail a little easier to face. The cook made the team. Cowboys, known for their humor and colorful language, had a surprising amount of respect for the person who ran the chuck wagon. The trail cook was rarely called simply cook. According to Dr. Richard W. Slatta, cowboys used a whole range of playful and admiring nicknames, including cookie, bean master, pot rustler, biscuit shooter, dough puncher, grub slinger, and koozie, the last one coming from the Spanish word for cook, cocinero. This respect came not only from the hearty meals they served, but also from the long hours they worked. Cooks often rose earlier than anyone else to prepare breakfast, and were still busy after the cowboys had finished for the day. As soon as one meal was done, the cook had to move ahead with the chuck wagon, set up again, and get ready for the next one. On the trail, dinner usually referred to the midday meal, while supper was eaten in the evening. Despite working with limited ingredients, a good cook knew how to keep meals varied and satisfying. But their responsibilities went far beyond food. The chuck wagon also carried basic medical supplies, and cooks often acted as informal doctors or veterinarians when someone or some animal needed help. Because they kept the crew fed, organized, and in better spirits, the cook held a position of real importance. They were generally paid more than ordinary cowboys, reflecting their value to the operation. A skilled cook could make a cattle drive smoother and more successful, while a poor one might even discourage cowboys from signing on with a particular ranch in the future. Coffee was taken strong and barefooted. Coffee was a daily essential in the Old West, but making it on the trail was not as effortless as it might sound. Unroasted green coffee beans kept the longest, so before anyone could enjoy a cup, the beans first had to be roasted and then ground by hand. That began to change when 2 ambitious businessmen started selling ready-roasted and even pre-ground coffee. On the West Coast, James A. Folger became the favorite among gold miners, while John Arbuckle Jr. created the brand that became closely associated with life on the frontier. Arbuckle's success came from a clever method of preserving both freshness and flavor. As HistoryNet notes, while roasting the beans, he coated them with a mixture of sugar, eggs, and Irish moss. This treatment helped protect the beans and gave them a distinctive taste. Arbuckle's coffee became so well known that, for many cowboys, his name was practically another word for coffee. For working cowboys, coffee was more than a luxury. It was a practical necessity. Their days started before sunrise and often stretched late into the night, especially during trail drives and night guard duty. Before the era of chuck wagons, many cowboys simply carried a small coffee pot in their saddlebags and brewed their own when they could. Once chuck wagons became standard on cattle drives, coffee was almost always available. Cooks kept large 5-gallon pots simmering over the fire so the crew could refill their cups throughout the day. According to True West magazine, cowboys preferred their coffee very strong enough to float a horseshoe, and usually drank it plain or black, whether out of habit or convenience. To keep the brew as powerful as possible, trail cooks often added fresh grounds on top of the old ones until the pot was nearly full of used coffee grounds. One cook, Oliver Nelson, wrote that the men half lived on coffee. For many cowboys, it was the one reliable source of warmth and alertness during long night shifts and harsh weather on the open range. Easy access to fresh meat. Driving cattle around the clock meant that cowboys always had access to beef, and enjoying a fresh steak or roast on the trail felt like a true luxury. However, fresh meat was only practical when there were enough hands to eat an entire animal quickly. As Dr. Slata recounts from one cowboy's memory, small trail crews simply couldn't finish a whole steer before it spoiled, especially in the heat of the western summer. Another challenge was the size of the cattle themselves. With no refrigeration and temperatures often soaring, fresh meat would not stay good for long. Dr. Slata also mentions an old saying shared by more frugal ranchers: only a fool eats his own beef. This reflected a business-minded view. Cattle were valuable assets meant to be sold, not consumed casually. Because of these limitations, preserved beef became a far more common option on the trail. Without cooling methods, raw meat spoiled quickly, but dried beef, especially jerky, could last for months. Cowboys often ate jerky as a convenient source of protein, but it was also frequently added to stews. Simmering it in a Dutch oven softened the meat again and added flavor and substance to a simple meal. When beef was not available or practical, the open range offered opportunities to supplement the diet with other game. Cowboys sometimes encountered deer, buffalo, and smaller animals such as hares or possums. These could be cooked into stews or prepared on their own, adding occasional variety to an otherwise predictable frontier menu. Common breads were sourdough and hardtack. Sourdough was the bread of choice for many trail crews, especially when a chuck wagon and a dedicated cook were part of the operation. The cook would wake before everyone else to tend the sourdough starter, a mixture of flour and water left to ferment naturally. As Bread and Basil explains, this fermentation process produces lactic acid bacteria and wild yeast, creating a natural leavening agent that can be used for many different types of bread. Once the starter was active, it could be mixed with fresh flour and water to create dough. Although maintaining the starter required consistent attention, it allowed cowboys to enjoy freshly baked bread even while traveling. Sourdough was also the base for biscuits and flapjacks cooked in Dutch ovens or skillets, giving many trail meals a pleasantly tangy flavor. A far less appealing option, but still common, was hardtack. These extremely simple biscuits, made only from flour, water, and salt, were baked until completely dry. Their lack of moisture gave them an exceptionally long shelf life, lasting months or even years without spoiling. Despite its practicality, hardtack was notoriously difficult to eat. Cowboys often needed to soak it in coffee, water, or milk just to make it chewable. The idea of long-lasting biscuits had been used by soldiers and sailors long before the American West. But trail cooks found an additional purpose for hardtack, using it as a thickener in stews. In that form, it became far more enjoyable and helped to stretch ingredients during long drives. Calf fries, a trail delicacy and tradition. Calf fries were a seasonal specialty on the frontier, available only during a specific time of year. Known by several humorous nicknames, including the ironic Rocky Mountain oysters and prairie oysters, they were gathered in the spring when ranchers carried out routine herd management and removed certain organs from young male calves. This practice helped regulate the herd and was believed to produce milder, more manageable animals, and eventually more tender beef. Rather than discarding anything, cowboys followed a long-standing tradition of using every part of the animal. The leftover organs became an example of resourcefulness that defined ranching life. Nutritionally, calf fries mainly offered an unconventional source of protein, but cowboys often credited them with broader health benefits. According to wagoner cowboys, many believed that eating this part of a healthy animal could, in some way, promote good health for the person consuming it. Whether or not these beliefs held scientific weight, calf fries also carried a reputation as an aphrodisiac. Despite their unique nature, they were genuinely enjoyed by many and became a memorable part of cowboy cuisine. While Old West cowboys typically cooked calf fries directly over hot coals, The tradition continues today with modern variations. Contemporary recipes often involve barbecuing or deep frying them and serving the dish with a flavorful dipping sauce, keeping this historic frontier food alive in a new era. The trailside benefits of airtights. Cowboys gained access to a new category of food once the chuck wagon became part of cattle drives. Dr. Slata notes that cowboys referred to canned goods as airtights, and these items added much-needed variety to an otherwise limited trail diet. Canning was still a relatively recent invention during the Old West era. It had been developed in the early 19th century in Europe as a way to give military units better nutrition than what dried meat and hardtack alone could provide. Although convenient by frontier standards, canned goods were not yet easy to open, since the modern can opener had not been widely introduced. Cowboys often had to break into them using whatever tools were available, typically a hammer and a knife. Even so, airtights were worth the effort because they offered flavors and nutrients that were difficult to obtain on the open range. Their metal containers were durable enough to survive long, rugged journeys. Canned fruits and vegetables were especially valuable. They provided something close to fresh produce, which cowboys rarely encountered on long drives. Without airtights, the only fruits available were dried ones, such as apples or prunes, which could be eaten as snacks or cooked into simple desserts, true treats in trail conditions. Canned peaches, pears, or other fruits expanded those possibilities significantly. Certain products even offered specific health benefits. For example, canned tomatoes with their natural acidity were considered helpful for easing the effects of dust inhalation, an unavoidable part of life on the cattle trails. Overall, airtights made the cowboy diet a little more varied, nutritious, and enjoyable in a landscape where fresh food was scarce. Sow belly and overland trout. When beef was unavailable, pork became the primary meat in many cowboy diets, especially during periods when the Civil War created shortages of cattle. Pork was easy to preserve in different forms, and the most common version on the trail was sow belly, also known as salt pork. The name refers to the cut of meat used, and the heavy salting process allowed it to remain edible for extended periods. To preserve sow belly, the meat was packed in layers of salt, which drew out moisture and kept it from spoiling. This method was simple and effective, but before eating it, cowboys had to soak the meat in water for a long time to remove enough salt to make it both safe and pleasant to consume. Another traditional preservation technique involves storing pork in barrels of brine. This approach also kept the meat from spoiling but resulted in a more tender product. Once cooked, salt pork became a popular breakfast item and an essential part of everyday trail cooking. A related but slightly different product was overland trout, a tongue-in-cheek frontier nickname for thinly sliced bacon. As Recipe Goldmine notes, the term played on humorous Old West slang for pigs and hogs. Though not as common as salt pork, bacon still appeared on the trail when available. Both types of pork were rich in fat, which was especially valuable to cowboys. High-fat foods provided long-lasting energy and a satisfying fullness, qualities that made them a central part of practical frontier cuisine. Taters and whistleberries. Cowboys working on ranches might occasionally enjoy more potatoes, but out on the cattle trail, beans, often jokingly called whistleberries, were the main vegetable available and formed the core of most meals. Author Natalie Bright records trail driver Lee D. Leverett's description of this ever-present food. The cook could boil them, bake them, or even overcook them. Yet no matter how they were served, beans remained a constant part of the cowboy's diet. As Leverett put it, breakfast was beans with beef, dinner reversed the order, and supper offered yet another helping of the same combination. Beans also reflected the strong Mexican influence on cowboy cooking. They were sometimes called frijoles or even Mexican strawberries in trail slang. As a dried food, beans were lightweight, naturally long-lasting, and able to withstand the demands of long drives across harsh terrain. Nutritionally, beans offered nearly everything a cowboy needed. They were filling, adaptable, high in fiber, and packed with protein. Cooks added them to many dishes, and they could simmer overnight in a Dutch oven, becoming the base for soups, stews, and hearty sides. When eaten on their own, beans were often flavored with a touch of molasses added to the cooking water. This simple technique created an early form of baked beans, a dish that became a classic and has roots stretching back to the Old West. Dutch oven delights. Beans appeared in many cowboy soups and stews, but trail cooks were surprisingly creative with their Dutch ovens. One of the most popular dishes they prepared was chili. The origins of chili are surrounded by folklore, stories involving Aztec traditions, legends, and imaginative tales about its creation. Although its beginnings remain somewhat mysterious, most historians agree it likely developed in the American Southwest. For cowboys, chili was practical. It allowed them to combine two ingredients they almost always had on hand: meat and beans. What's Cooking America notes that some 19th century Spanish priests even cautioned their congregations against eating chili, believing that chili peppers used for seasoning could stir up too much excitement. They dramatically referred to the dish as the soup of the devil, though such descriptions reflected cultural attitudes rather than historical fact. The name chili con carne suggests a possible Mexican origin, but documented evidence does not clearly support this. However, another frontier stew was directly inspired by Mexican cooking. Son of a Gun stew was the cowboy adaptation of menudo, a humble dish designed to ensure no part of an animal went to waste. This stew relied on a wide range of leftover cuts. Dr. Slata cites Ramon F. Adams' colorful explanation that everything from the cow, except the hair, horns, and its cry, could go into the pot. Ingredients such as tripe, tongue, liver, and marrow gave the dish a very distinctive taste. According to trail lore, this hearty mixture was also believed to help ease the effects of a long night, making it a favored remedy among cowboys. Cornmeal in many forms. Although Hollywood often exaggerates the amount of contact cowboys had with Native Americans, the trail culture did adopt several indigenous cooking practices refined over many generations of living closely with the land. One of the most useful contributions was cornmeal, produced from dried, ground corn. Cornmeal became a practical staple in chuck wagon kitchens because it was lightweight, long-lasting, and easy to transform into a variety of dishes with only a few additional ingredients. Trail cooks often used it to thicken soups and stews, but it truly shined in baked goods. With just water and a pinch of salt, cornmeal could be shaped into dough for simple biscuits or flat cakes. When cooked in a cast iron skillet, it became cornbread, a warm, nourishing side dish. Its natural hint of sweetness paired well with hearty or spicy Dutch oven meals. This pairing of cornbread and chili, enjoyed so often around the campfire, is likely one of the cowboy-era combinations that later grew into a beloved American food tradition. When you peel back the myths of Hollywood, the real cowboy diet tells a story of grit, resourcefulness, and frontier ingenuity. These men lived day to day on foods that were simple yet surprisingly inventive. Beans bubbling in Dutch ovens, sourdough rising before dawn, strong coffee simmering nonstop, and whatever fresh or preserved meat they could manage along the trail. It wasn't glamorous, but it fueled one of the toughest jobs in American history. And maybe that's the charm of it. The cowboy table reminds us that survival on the frontier wasn't about luxury. It was about making the most of what you had and sharing it with the crew under a wide open sky. If you enjoyed diving into the real flavors of the Old West, leave a comment below and tell us which cowboy foods surprised you the most. Then hit that subscribe button to join us for more untold stories of frontier life.